Thank you very, very much. This was absolutely amazing. Also very confirming and affirming for some of the key existential questions and potential actions that we need. I think if I may now to call upon Rabbi Daniel. And Rabbi Daniel, I'm going to, in addition to all those questions and perhaps taking, reflecting and engaging with some of what you've heard, also your traditional religious perspectives and spiritual perspectives on what you see and how you see this, but also perhaps your advocacy and call upon humanity, regardless of any religious or spiritual affiliation specific, but as humanity, given what you've heard from what our distinguished speakers have said. Please, Rabbi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I appreciate all of you who are here as we try to learn and think together. I want to start with a little exercise. Ask everybody to close your eyes for a moment and picture the first image that comes to mind when you hear the word environment. Now open your eyes and acknowledge whether or not there were any people in that picture. When I do this in rooms of people, I've never had more than 5% raise their hands or otherwise indicate that there were people. And this is, I think, part of the fundamental problem, that we have managed to let ourselves be trained that the environment is something out there, something separate from us. It's whales or wilderness, when indeed environment is everywhere we live, every place that we work or play or pray or learn together. And until we get rid of that dualism, until we understand that humanity is part of the environment and that the environment is not something apart from us, then we're going to be in the midst of one environmental crisis after another. Once we recognize that, then we can begin to address this. And as our previous speakers have mentioned, we've got some very difficult choices. Rabbinic thought talks about two situations in which we make choices. There's b'chat chala and b'diavad. B'chat chala is a theoretical, fresh start where you are able to do what is ideal. And b'diavad is when you're in the midst. And almost in every occasion that we have, we're in the midst somehow. And we need to deal with less than ideal solutions because we've already inherited some karmic past, some past problems, some past oppression of people and the land. And right now we find ourselves in not just in the midst, but racing towards various cliffs. And in that kind of situation, we need to be thinking about what do we need to do next and what do we need to do long term. And I think Michael was referring to some of that when he talked about the idea of changing consumption patterns, which is something that has to happen long term and is not going to happen with enough rapidity for us to stave off disaster in our planet. So how do we think about that? What are some ways that we can be guided by, for example, the Jewish tradition or other traditions in what we do? A couple of ethical guidelines that come to mind immediately. I serve as the director of the Coalition on the Environment and Jewish Life, but I'm also a congregational rabbi, and one of my tasks as a rabbi is to advise couples as they prepare for a wedding. And whether you've ever been to a Jewish wedding or not, the symbol that you probably know about is the wedding canopy and the breaking of the glass. The wedding canopy is often described as a symbol for the home. I'll let you in on a secret that most Jews don't know as well, which is that it's actually the symbol of the bedroom. And part of the reason for doing that is for us to understand that one of our hardest tasks as people is understanding where to put up boundaries. That's challenging because sometimes we put up boundaries that are too high and that don't let the other in, and sometimes we put up no boundaries and we don't manage to create sacred space. And so that's a challenge of every couple and of every society. What are the things that we need to share? What are the ways that we need to be cognizant of each other? And when do we need to give each other sufficient space to become ourselves and our highest selves? The glass is probably even more important as a symbol for what we're talking about today, because among its many shades of symbolism, part of what it indicates to us is that there are many things in life that are easier to break than to fix. In modern times, people have started to talk about what they call the precautionary principle, which is basically articulating that same point. But I like to think of it in biblical terms as the parapet principle. In Deuteronomy, amidst a series of ideas about thinking about the future. For example, that when you see a bird with a nest, that you don't take both the eggs and the parent because you want to let the next generation live. It says that when you build a house, you have to put a parapet around the roof. A parapet being not two dogs, but a little low roof, little low wall that you put around the edge of the roof to keep yourself from falling off the edge. I live in northeastern PA. I'm right now in Wisconsin, in the land of the Ho-Chunk and the Mesquite peoples, where my family grew up. And in both places, we don't have flat roofs because there's too much snow. But in the Middle East, flat roofs are common because that's they're very useful. You don't have to worry about snow. There's not so much rain, and on your roof you can garden, you can hang clothes, you can sunbathe. And what's interesting is that the tradition doesn't say, try not to fall off a roof, or the town should have a emergency system for picking up people after they've fallen off the roof, but that we recognize that we're fallible, and so we build a barrier, and we try to prevent things from happening before they happen. The problem when we're facing the idea of extractive minerals and a green future is that the barrier against our climate heating is taking actions that it may cause near-term harm, such as extracting minerals for a transition away from a fossil fuel economy. So in that case, what do we do? First of all, we can turn to actions that are more wholly good, reforestation, agricultural practices that sink carbon rather than give rise to more carbon emissions, lowering consumption. But we are going to need to use some of these technologies. Eventually, we can get to a point where those technologies can be closed loops, where we can have designed things with the idea that they're going to be recycled and reused again and again and again, but we're not there yet. So in that case, I think we can be guided by a second principle, which is that we don't own anything, that as humans, we are tenants on this land, which is in our tradition regarded as being ultimately owned by the divine. However you picture that, the idea of getting past notions of humans having absolute ownership over anything, I think are going to be important for us to be able to address the future. And that means, for example, instead of turning over to a corporation that will make a profit on it for these extractive mines, to think about ways of that being a societal project, a societal project that needs to recognize Indigenous rights, that needs to start by thinking of whose voices are being ignored, whether that's segments of the human community or other parts of the biotic community. But that's not going to be enough. There are places, certainly in the world, where countries own these mines, and they're behaving no better than when corporations own mines. I was recently traveling in Zimbabwe, where government leaders facing a cash shortfall sold their national lithium mines to China, which proceeded to give short-term payments and then to essentially increase the debt of the country to the Chinese for the foreseeable future, and to put a nation in a place where it's going to have a very hard time being able to create a future for itself. So trying to figure out international standards where we govern the extraction of these minerals, to see them as something that is a shared heritage of humanity, and to manage extraction in a way that that is seeking to provide not only the broadest benefit to the most people, but at the same time recognizing specifically who may be harmed and thinking about how do we minimize that. That includes, I think, setting off limits certain areas, even when there is a resource there that we think is completely invaluable. Very recently, the Biden administration set aside swaths of land around the Grand Canyon as off limits for uranium mining. This is something that my organization, the Coalition on the Environment and Jewish Life, has been working on for years, not only because of the unique nature of the Grand Canyon, but because of the peoples, the Havasu Nation and other nations whose very lives would be threatened by uranium mining. And so there will need to be boundaries like the chuppah, where we say this is just off limits, this is sacred, for reasons of a particular ecosystem or particular peoples. We're going to need to vastly increase our investment, not only in these kinds of technologies, but in perhaps the best climate technology of all, which are trees. A recent study showed that in the United States, within the next 50 years, 1 out of every 6 tree species is in danger of going extinct, much higher than had been previously considered. And around the globe, those numbers are even worse. So if I was going to say, one thing for people to do, the immediate practical thing that I would say is learn what are native trees in your area, learn the proper environments, and plant. But I don't want to leave you with just that practical thing, because there's this more fundamental problem that we have in terms of how we treat each other. And so the other thing, and when you ask rabbis to give you a list of 3 things, they usually give you a list of 5 or 10. Even when they say it's going to be a list of 10 things, it's got 12 in it. So my one thing is 2 things. And the second part of that one thing is for us to love each other more. That may not sound like practical advice, but it is the most deeply practical thing that we could do, to recognize the shared image of the divine in every human being and in all of life, to extend the idea of King's beloved community to all that lives on our planet, and to love more. When we love more, we recognize that the consequences of our action, and we try to minimize those negative consequences as much as possible, and to build positive connections as much as possible. And if we do that, I think that we will move through this transition with greater holiness and greater attention to building a future that is truly green and sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Rabbi. This was also another brilliant presentation, and it very nicely links into some of the key aspects that were shared, but also gives us some very concrete actions to undertake. Thank you very much. I think just before I delve into a couple of words from myself and hand over to the Executive Director of the Temple of Understanding, Alison Van Dyke, I'd like to please remind our beloved listeners that please put your questions into the Q&A function so that we can try and see if we can honor some of them before we conclude fully. Again, just allow me to make 3 key points. I do not represent all Muslims by any stretch of the imagination. I am of the Muslim faith. I do want to share a couple of perspectives from, if you will, my understanding and practice of the Muslim traditions, but also share another very, shall I say, generic point, in which is to honor something that all of the speakers from Chief Oren's to our Rabbi have spoken about, which is the issue of interdependence of life, all life. And I think if we try to honor that perspective and that very basic understanding, we also need to come to terms with the fact that the ones identified as the other, ostensibly the other doing harm, whether it's corporate interest or greed or profit or corporations in general or whatever, I think we need to reflect for a second on the point that was made by the Rabbi and very much iterated by so many of you, which is, if we have to love one another, that will probably have to include also those who work with a corporate interest in mind, and that might be perhaps the hardest and yet the most necessary challenge that we encounter in trying to face the very, very, very real scarcity of kindness that is above all demonstrated by what's happening around us on this planet, and that is so deeply and very vividly illustrated by the act of extraction from this earth, that is fundamentally about extracting kindness from amongst one another and from the very roots of this sustenance, sustaining earth and environment. So the question then becomes, well, what would it be like to actually have to love this other that is causing tremendous harm? Because it's all very well that we can speak to one another and convince one another and form movements with one another. Plenty movements, by the way. It's not a lack of movements and engagement or activism. There's actually plenty. And I would argue that perhaps we have too many, but that's another point. In what would it mean to love those who are harming effectively? What would that entail? What is that a karmic necessity and responsibility, Michael? And what does that mean then for our actions as humans on this earth? So that's just a general reflection with all of you. I also just want to point, end with 2 points from my own faith tradition. The first is that from a Muslim perspective and in the Holy Quran, it is very clear that as the representatives of the divinity and the divine image of God, we actually have an inescapable responsibility, obligation to look after one another and all life all life on this planet. It isn't about, gee, maybe we should do this. It is about, you cannot be a person of Muslim faith, which for Muslims, by the way, goes all the way back to Abraham. But you cannot be a person who is a Muslim unless and until you fulfill that obligation of looking after, of stewarding, of taking care of nurturing, 1,000,001 words in English language, basically be responsible for this planet and all life on it, right? It's not an option. It is a mandate. It is obligatory. One point. The second point is also in the Holy Quran. It says very clearly in a number of different chapters how we will harm this earth. We will, and we will live to watch each other do it and observe each other to do it. So there's nothing new from the Quranic perspective here. It's actually telling us you might want to beware because you're going to do this. And no matter what we say to you, we as the divine, you will do this. You will commit this harm. And the only way to step back from this effectively is indeed to acknowledge our limitations, our harm, to take responsibility for the harm, and to be more loving and kind and just towards this earth. That is in the Quran, right? And it's only reading it years later with a little bit of that environmental consciousness in mind that I think, oh my goodness, I learned it by heart. Many of us learned this by heart as Muslims from school, but we never realized until we began to be conscious of this environmental movement. And then my last point, I think it's important to realize, if you don't mind, that we owe a great deal to all of you and all of those not in this space who have been heralding and trying to take responsibility and sometimes committing very painful acts to bring to awareness the reality of what is happening on this earth. It is too easy to say, well, we need to just follow the right way of doing things. Some people have had to pay with their lives. Many have paid with their lives to help us see what is going on. And it behooves us to systematically honor those who have paid with their lives to help us see the obvious, and never, ever to ignore and to think that we are reinventing the wheel, because there have been those who have given their lives for us to see and be where we are today. And I want to end with that note and hand over to our beloved Alison. Thank you so very much for this.
So I have a question, and it has to do with thinking about a practical way of approaching this problem of corporations. As I said earlier, talking with Oren Lyons, corporations saying that they're reducing their production, but on the other hand, they're really not. They're really increasing their production. So what alternative can you imagine that we could offer to them to help them make the transition? Because I think it is a question of saying, let us help you make this transition. We can't just say don't. We have to say, what can we do? What can we offer you? So anybody take that one on?
Well, I gladly take the lead on that. Again, our focus is on stop the money pipeline. Now, how do you sometimes help someone who doesn't want your help? You need to give them some incentives. So the one thing that we want to show them is that should they continue in their ways of extracting fossil fuels from the environment and putting it into the atmosphere, that they will not make the monies that they've been making, as you know, by record profits. We're not talking about revenues. We're talking about profits, record. We need to show them that if they continue their ways, that they will not do well. But if they are to transition their ways over into a more renewable structure, that there will be rewards for them. So we need to give them an incentive to do good. We can't just tell them, we can't just lecture to them, we have to show them. Now, sometimes, shall we call it tough love? This is what we need to do. If you continue what you're doing, you will have consequences that are not suitable to your benefactors. If you move in the other direction, maybe there is good for all of us.
Not so much to directly answer that question, but also a gentle reminder, we have another very important question, Alison.
Oh, good.
that basically in terms of incentivizing, I completely agree with Michael. We have an obligation to incentivize and not just to decry and to criminalize and to complain and to punish. We have an obligation to be positively incentivizing, which in and of itself emanates from this idea that we have to love this other. What kind of incentives are there already? I think there's quite a few. I would venture to say that we need to acknowledge those in the corporate world who have made a commitment to stop extraction, stop reliance on fossil fuels. There are those, they are there. And I think they need to be acknowledged and recognized for that. And we need to walk the journey with them, alongside them, and not just standing outside their meeting spaces all the time, which we have to do anyway. But what else can we do to walk alongside those who have made that, or if you will, who have taken that leap of faith and made that commitment, and are how can we hold them publicly accountable while we walk alongside them, I think is the issue. But do we even know who they are? Can we celebrate them? Can we acknowledge them? Can we recognize? And that's already part of what we would have to do in such conversations. If I may, just to remind that there's a very good question from a colleague who has been listening, and it says Oak Flats in Arizona is AZ. I'm not American, but I'm assuming, yeah, okay. Oak Flats in Arizona was threatened by mining interests. The mineral is copper. Copper is something we all need. Does anyone track actual mineral needs? And how can we know what is really needed and not just needed for corporate profits only? I'm handing over that question because I do not know the answer. So who would like to take that question?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I worked with the Oak Flats and the Apache Stronghold over the last year in terms of dismantling the doctrine of discovery. And so I'm fairly familiar with how Resolution Copper, which is owned by two mega transnational corporations, one which is based in Australia and the other in Brazil. The issue here is that, yes, we do need copper. 75% of this copper would go towards China, and 25% would, they say, meet demands in the US up until 2060. So over the next 40, 30, 35 years or so, would meet US demands, 1/4 of the US demands. The rest would go to China. And the issue is, when we look at overconsumption, we're looking at what is being built in China, what is being used, what the copper that's being used over there, where is that going? What's happening there? A lot of that is coming back to our goods. It's going into, very little of it is going into the green economy development in China, as it turns out. So this comes back to the overconsumption, that, you know, a lot of these goods are being produced in China, which are then coming back to us. Do we need those goods at all? This is extraction, and then very little of it is actually coming back to the Apache. You know, this is the common thing. So I guess I would encourage people to look more deeply at the companies themselves. This information isn't so readily available, but it is available. You know, what the demand is, what they would be using, the history of these corporations. You can find out that information easily if you do a little bit of, or easily enough if you do some digging, in terms of, do we need that copper?
But I'd like to add to Luke that, yes, knowing the demand is knowable. But what we also need to understand is that there is a transition away from copper because of its expense and other things. And of course, a lot of the copper and aluminum is being used in the high tension transmission lines that we need for solar, wind, hydro, the clean energy that we need for electrification as we go through decarbonization. And there are some breakthrough technologies that are happening now where we will be less dependent on copper. But as Chief Lyons said earlier, it doesn't look good. The mining of copper is going to be at a steep curve upward for years to come until those transitions happen, because we need to build out so much because of our demand. So it's just not a good scenario. Demand is high, it's going to get higher. Alternatives are there. It's going to be slow getting there. As Chief said, doesn't look good.
Great. Thank you, Michael and Luke. It seems to me that there are two parts to Marilyn's very good question. The first is, in a sense, and forgive me for paraphrasing, is where can I get this information? Where is this information available? And is it, you know, do you go do a Google search, or are there already any records or documents that can track the need for copper, who's doing what, how it can be perhaps the point that Michael mentioned is we understand that there will be more before we get to the point of less, and that more that is necessary will harm more. But where are we finding some of this research and some of the studies and perhaps some of the recommendations for what we should nevertheless do, as bleak as the picture is, we still need to do? And I think maybe just a call, if I may, based on Marilyn's question and the very good responses to the Temple of Understanding, to help maybe put together some documentation or on a website or something that makes it available for people to track. And maybe people like Luke and your remarkable movement, the Laudato Si movement, can help share some resources with the temple that can be accessed. So just to have the knowledge is incredibly powerful and important. And if those of us who know can share, and there's a central place to go and check, and I know that Susie's been doing some remarkable work within the Temple of Understanding on this space, that documentation in and of itself should never be underestimated. So thank you very much for that. And Michael's already sharing on the web, on the chat. Thank you, indeed. Great. Any other questions that we seem to have, or is this now when I actually really do hand over to Allison to conclude?
Sure, I can jump in if you want. So I asked that question to Bill McKibben about 3 weeks ago when he came to our church and he talked, and I was very interested in what he said, because it was a brilliant talk, by the way. He is an amazing person and has so much knowledge and background in this field. But he basically said, we need to buy them out, to buy the corporations out. Now, you know, I thought it was a great answer, but I'm just wondering if anybody has an idea, like, does that seem practical, or should we really just try to go after the money train and stop it there? I mean, or maybe both, or Michael, I don't know.
Well, I'm pleased to be associated with McKibben's organization, Third Act, is that I'm the facilitator for Third Act Upstate New York. I just put into the chat a most recent article from July 5th that Bill wrote on this very subject that we've been talking about today on extraction. So it's worth the read. Well put. He talks about copper in there, by the way. But buy them out. Again, I think that Bill McKibben has an interesting concept on moving money around. Something that I was talking about earlier there on, we have to give them incentives to not do A, but rather to do B, not to do the harm, but to do the good. So when he says we need to buy them out, certainly the money is there, but it is concentrated amongst the few. Just to take a quick moment. We understand public equity. That's where our 401ks and our exchange traded funds are and the like. There's this other thing called private equity. Now, to enter that realm, this is the realm of the 1%. They start their investment portfolios at $1 million minimum. So most of us don't participate in that private equity realm. And there's a lot of damnation that is cast upon the private equity people because of what they do. And it's very mysterious because this is not publicly traded knowledge. But also they do an immense amount of good. Most of the transition is going to be financed by private equity. So maybe this is somewhat what Bill McKibben is talking about, is that there are good people out there. There's an amazing amount of wealth that we need to see where we are buying out some of the folks and transitioning them. There are a few asset managers out there right now that are buying up, let's call them dirty companies, and they're cleaning them. So it's being done. Again, I think it goes back to what Rabbi Daniel said and a few others. Is it being done with inside the time frame we have to avert the existential tipping points?
Thank you. Well, we do have to bring this to conclusion, and I just want to thank all of our speakers, and of course, Chief Oren Lyons, for this amazing discussion. which could go on and on and on. And hopefully we will keep working on this topic. And I also want to be sure to thank the Interfaith Awareness Week. They are our host for this event. And I want to thank them so much for all the good work that they are doing out there in California. And thank all of you for attending. Thank all of you for donating to the Temple of Understanding. We appreciate everything that, that you all are doing in this work. And we are, as Azza said, we are one of many interfaith organizations working on all of these topics. So please support and help all of us. Our next program for Eco-Justice for All is going to be on September 28th from 6 to 7 p.m. It's a late one because it is Indigenous voices from Australia and the Pacific on the climate crisis. It's a dialogue with leaders from religious traditions from the Fiji, from Vanuatu, Samoa, Tonga, and Australia. Thank you, everyone, for this wonderful discussion.